Are there any other amendments? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Congressman, is it number 5 or 8?
It's number 8.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it, number 8. Does he want to? He's the chair on here. Okay. See if I can spill this over the computer.
Ask the clerk to report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Gingrey. In Section 321, Section 782 is amended to read as follows. Section 782, proceeds from auctions of allowances.
The chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia to explain his amendment.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Today, our economic prospects are grim. United States jobless rate is currently at 8.9% and rising. State budgets are reeling as more and more Americans seek government assistance programs. Unfortunately, Mr. Chairman, the underlying legislation will only further complicate our economic troubles, particularly with the enactment of such a confusing and inequitable allowance allocation. This allowance scheme will essentially take money out of the pockets of every single energy consumer and redistribute those dollars in the form of allowances to businesses. Accordingly, my amendment requires that 100% of emission allowances be auctioned off by the administrator and that the proceeds be returned to the state in which the covered entity is located. Mr. Chairman, governors then would be able to use the funds to assist consumers, workers, and businesses in their own states to help fund research and development. And most importantly, the amendment ensures that there are no free allowances for federal government bureaucrats to squander on backroom deals. Mr. Chairman, auction and emission allowances is the most efficient way to set market prices, and it bars the giving of handouts to those that were first to beat a path to Congress. Testifying before the Budget Committee in March, even Budget Director Peter Orszag supported auction and emission allowance when he said this: if you don't auction the permits, it would represent the largest corporate welfare program that has ever been enacted in the history of the United States. Mr. Chairman, the approach outlined in this amendment is consistent with what President Obama proposed in his own budget. It is with this spirit of true bipartisanship that I ask my colleagues to support the amendment before them. And I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman's time has expired. Does anyone seek recognition? The chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas.
Thank you very much, and that's exactly the point. I'm from Texas. The only question I have is, if Texas accepted the money and then we secede it, would we be able to keep it?
We would double it.
Right. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there any other members seeking recognition? Chair recognizes the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Barton.
Briefly, in support of the Gingrey amendment, I'm not sure what he said, so I don't want to repeat. I hope I don't repeat it, but the Obama administration initial proposal on climate change was 100% auction. And those of you that most believe that this is a serious problem
this evening,
and I'm a noted skeptic in that arena, but if you think it is, the best way to quickly address it is to require that every allowance be auctioned. That's fair, treats everybody in the economy that uses products that create CO2 the same.
After the Gingrey vote, they're going to
If you want to try to rebate
okay, good.
the proceeds in various ways to alleviate the obvious pain that those on our side believe you're going to have if you go into this arena, you might want to. I'm not sure how Mr. Gingrey's amendment handles the proceeds of the auction. At one time, it was all rebated back to the states.
Yeah, if the gentleman will yield, that is exactly right. It would, wherever the money came from, it would go back to those states, and the governor would decide how it would be.
So we've set it up to be revenue neutral, but at least in the initial stage, you would get a fair distribution based on the market of who most valued the allowances for CO2. So I believe that this would be, if you're the truest of true believers, then you should support the Gingrey Amendment, and with that, I would yield back the balance of my time.
Great. Gentleman's time has expired. Are there other members seeking recognition? The chair will recognize himself. I rise in opposition to the Gingrey Amendment, and I understand the intent of the gentleman, and eventually I think we will reach a point where 100% of the allowances are auctioned. But as we have discussed throughout the course of this week, there have been negotiations that have taken place that deal with the transition from the era in which we're living to the era which will occur when we're fully within the no-carbon, low-carbon era. And towards that goal, 15% of the allowances have been apportioned for the trade-sensitive, energy-intensive industries in our country, such as steel and aluminum and cement and paper, so that they are not exploited by the Chinese or the Indians or others in a global competitive marketplace. We think that's necessary, and we've worked with those industries to ensure that they are given the tools that are necessary to be able to make a successful transition. In addition, 35% of the allowances are set aside so that we can deal with the impact of higher electricity rates upon the consumers in our country. And that formula is in place as well during a transition period in order to make sure that the utility industry can make the transition, but at the same time the consumers are protected from severe adverse consequences. Now, the same is also true for natural gas and for home heating oil, so that in each one of those areas we have thought through ways in which ordinary families are protected. So while I understand the intent of the gentleman, and I think eventually we will reach that point where 100% are auctioned off, at this time it just would be too disruptive to the trade affected industries and to the consumers in the United States. I urge an aye vote.
Will the Chairman yield?
I'll be glad to yield.
And I appreciate the gentleman yielding. And let me just say briefly that to me, all of the machinations that have gone on in the last several weeks in regard to these allowances, Mr. Chairman, it smacks a lot of the earmark process. And I know how we're on both sides of the aisle would like to see a fair approach to that and realize that there's real opportunities for mischief in that process. And you know, the same thing here. I think that this amendment, like Ranking Member Barton was saying, would guarantee absolute fairness, and everybody would have an equal bite at the apple, and it wouldn't be just those who maybe have an opportunity to be a little bit more accessible to members of Congress. So with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for yielding me the time.
I thank the gentleman. Again, Mr. Doyle and Mr. Inslee did an excellent job in negotiating with the steel and other industries. Mr. Boucher did an excellent job in negotiating with the utility industry. These benefits are less earmarks than they are more generic protections for industries across our economy as they are for consumers across our economy. And that's really the intent. But over time, we have as the full intention of the legislation that we move to a market-based system in its entirety, but it will take some time. So in conclusion, I urge a no vote on the Gingrey amendment. It would unbalance something that has been very carefully constructed, and I yield back the balance of my time. Are there other members seeking recognition on the Gingrey amendment? Seeing none, the vote then comes on that amendment. All those in favor signify by the sign of aye.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like a recorded vote.
The gentleman has asked for a recorded vote. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Waxman. Mr. Dingell. Mr. Dingell votes no. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey votes no. Mr. Boucher. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Gordon. Mr. Rush. Oh, Mr. Gordon. Mr. Gordon votes no. Ms. Eshoo. Ms. Eshoo votes no. Mr. Rush. Mr. Rush votes no. Mr. Stupak. Mr. Stupak, no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Green. Mr. Green votes no. Mr. Gett. Mr. Gett votes no. Mrs. Capps. Mrs. Capps, no. Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle, no. Ms. Harmon. Ms. Harmon, no. Mr. Kowski. Mr. Kowski, no. Mr. Gonzalez. Mr. Gonzalez, no. Mr. Inslee. Mr. Inslee votes no. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, no. Mr. Ross. Mr. Weiner. Mr. Weiner votes no. Mr. Matheson. Mr. Matheson, no. Mr. Butterfield. Mr. Butterfield, no. Mr. Melanson. Mr. Melanson, no. Mr. Barrow. Mr. Barrow, no. Mr. Hill. Mr. Hill, no. Ms. Matsui. Ms. Matsui votes no. Mrs. Christensen. Mrs. Christensen votes no. Ms. Castor. Ms. Castor, no. Mr. Sarbanes. Mr. Sarbanes votes no. Mr. Murphy of Connecticut. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Space. Mr. Space, no. Mr. McNerney. Mr. McNerney, no. Ms. Sutton. Ms. Sutton votes no. Mr. Braley. Mr. Welch. Mr. Welch votes no. Mr. Barton.
Aye.
Mr. Barton votes aye. Mr. Hall. Mr. Hall votes no. Mr. Upton. Mr. Upton votes no. Mr. Stearns. Mr. Stearns votes no. Mr. Deal. Mr. Whitfield. Mr. Whitfield, no. Mr. Shimkus. Mr. Shimkus, no. Mr. Shattuck. Mr. Shattuck, no. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, no. Mr. Boyer. Mr. Boyer passes. Mr. Radonovich. Mr. Radonovich, aye. Mr. Pitts. Can't hear him. Mr. Pitts votes aye. Ms. Bono-Mack. Ms. Bono-Mack, no. Mr. Walden. Mr. Walden, no. Mr. Terry. Mr. Terry, no. Mr. Rogers. Mr. Rogers votes no. Mrs. Myrick. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Murphy, Pennsylvania. Mr. Murphy votes no. Mr. Burgess. Ms. Blackburn.
Good news is this is the
Ms.
last.
Blackburn votes no.
So sounds like
Mr. Gingrey. Mr. Mr. Gingrey votes aye. Mr. Scully's. Mr. Scully's votes no.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Boucher. Mr. Boucher votes no. Mr. Pallone. Mr. Pallone votes no. Mr. Engel. Mr. Engel votes no. Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes no.
Mr. Chairman.
Over there. Mr. Boyer.
Over here.
Off on pass.
I need to change
aye.
my vote. Yeah.
Mr. Boyer votes off on pass. Just wait a minute. And on aye.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Waxman.
I vote no.
How am I recorded? Want to change from yes to
Miss-
no, please?
Mr. Radonovich is recorded as voting aye. Off aye
Please.
on no?
Votes no.
Okay.
Thank you.
Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess votes no.
Mr. Chairman,
Anybody else?
as soon as the vote's announced, could I be recognized to make an announcement?
Yes. Have all members responded to the call of the roll? Clerk will tally the vote.
It's not going to be pretty. Is Mr. Sullivan recorded?
Okay. Mr. Sullivan votes no.
Yeah.
How's your shoulder? Looks like you hurt a little bit. You fell down the stairs?
Clerk will announce the vote.
On that vote, Mr. Chairman, the yeas were 4, the nays were 52.
4 ayes, 52.
4 ayes and 52 noes.
And that was a roll call vote. The noes have it.
The eyes got cream. There's no question about it. Mr. Chairman, could I be recognized?
Mr.
for-
Barton's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask
Just a
all.
minute, let's get the committee to order.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask all Republican members to convene immediately in the Republican Lounge for a caucus about tomorrow's schedule. So
You don't want me to make any announcements over the timing?
I would rather not, because I want to break it to my side gently.
Okay, turn off your mic. The Republican members are going into a meeting, and we're going to adjourn for the evening. We will come back tomorrow at 10. The House is going to be finished with its business in late afternoon, and it would be my hope and expectation that we will get to the end of this bill an hour after the House is finished with its business, tomorrow. So with that information, I want to wish you all a good evening, a restful sleep, and we'll see everybody tomorrow morning at 10. And I'd like to ask everybody to get here on time, so if we have a lot of work to do, we can process that work.